You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. Hello there, and welcome back to our third podcast episode about the Overtures to the 2026 General Assembly. As I've mentioned in other episodes, I will include links in the show notes to resources if you want to dive in a little deeper. In the first episode, we talked about presbytery boundaries, denominational prayer requests, study committees, miscellaneous topics. In the second episode, we talked about overtures related to committees and agencies and related to the rules of discipline. And in this episode, we'll be talking about overtures related to officers, ordination, and transfer, and then some overtures that are specifically related to the roles of women in the church. One of the topics that's relevant to some of the overtures that we're going to discuss is the concept of the consent of the governed. There are multiple places where the Book of Church Order makes it clear that church members have a right to elect those who are going to hold authority over them, and that the way that churches exercise the authority that Christ has vested in the congregation is in the election of those elders. And so a number of these overtures reference ways in which church members ought to have consent in who has authority over them. There's a little bit of overlap with some of these overtures. There are some things related to mission churches that perhaps could have fit in this category of consent of the governed. So it's difficult sometimes to choose where to put those, but here are some other overtures related to mission churches. Overture 2 says that if there are already people who've been received into membership in a church plant, they should get to vote if the presbytery wishes to call a pastor to serve as the church planter. Overture 17 says that if presbytery wants to dissolve a mission church, it needs to follow the same procedures as dissolving a particular church, which would include giving 60 days notice, and the church would have the option to ask to withdraw from the PCA or to petition the presbytery not to dissolve the church. Overture 82 talks about what to do when a church has no pastor and only one ruling elder, or even no ruling elders. There's a provision for calling a congregational meeting and then the congregation consenting by vote to the temporary session that's placed in governance over them. Overture 18 would allow a mother church to call a church planter. Currently, only presbyteries can call a man to be a church planter, but sometimes there's a relationship between a mother church and a church that they're planting, in the sense that the session of the mother church acts as the temporary session of the church plant or the mission church. And so this overture would allow that mother church to also be the ones to call a man to serve as the planter of that mission church. Overtures 39 and 55 have to do with the role of assistant pastor. And the assistant pastor relationship to the congregation is a bit of a unique one in our polity. Other pastors, such as just your senior or solo pastor or an associate pastor, are elected by the congregation, and therefore they have authority over the congregation. They have a vote on the session. But assistant pastors are actually not elected by the congregation at large. They're elected by the session or called by the session. And so therefore they don't have a vote on the session. But because they're teaching elders, they do have a vote in the presbytery. And also it could be argued that they do have some level of authority in the church because they are preaching and shepherding and doing other elder-type tasks, even though they have not been elected by the congregation. So overtures 39 and 55 would both put limits on the duration of the call of an assistant pastor. Some other overtures that relate to officers in general Overture 1 relates to situations in which an assistant or an associate pastor is going to be called as the senior pastor. So, if there's been a senior pastor in a church and then he's retiring, or maybe he's moving on to another role, it it's not unusual for the church to want to call their assistant or their associate pastor to become the senior pastor. There is a provision in the Book of Church Order that was intended to prevent kind of a, hostile takeover where the associate or the assistant develops a following and turns people against the senior pastor and then tries to take his job away from him. And so the language in the BCO currently says that in order for an assistant or associate to assume the senior pastor role, they have to have a 4/5 vote of the congregation and a 3/4 vote of the presbytery. So this overture 1, would amend that language to say that they just need a 2/3 vote of the presbytery for this unique situation to take place. Overture 12 would allow some alternatives to a bachelor's degree for somebody who's seeking ordination as a teaching elder. So it could be an associate's degree plus at least 3 years of qualifying full-time vocational service, or it could be a high school diploma plus at least 10 years of qualifying full-time vocational service. Overture 21 is seeking to clarify what an examination would include for a man who's already been ordained in another denomination and is transferring in. When somebody's being ordained for the first time, the examination is fairly rigorous and extensive, and it might include things like needing to write exposition papers and theological analysis papers. So this overture would clarify that if somebody's already been ordained in another denomination, they wouldn't necessarily need to repeat all of that when they transfer their ordination into the PCA. Overture 22 has to do with the examination of elders when a church is joining a presbytery. If a church outside of the PCA wishes to become part of the PCA, then a part of that process would be that the presbytery would speak to the ruling elders of the church, or the men who would become ruling elders when the church becomes a PCA church, and make sure that they understand our Constitution and that they can subscribe to it in good faith. But there was perhaps a little bit of concern that this restriction might also be put on a church that's coming into a presbytery, not because it wasn't in the PCA and now wants to be in the PCA, but because the boundaries of presbyteries have changed. And so a church was once in one presbytery, and now it's being accepted into a new presbytery, but just because of the change of boundaries. So this overture just clarifies that in that situation, the ruling elders would not need to go through the same examination. Overture 24 also relates to the examination of teaching elders in a presbytery. There's one particular sentence that apparently has caused some confusion. It says, when the ordination of a minister is committed to a commission, the presbytery itself shall conduct the previous examination. So apparently some have understood this to be kind of an either-or proposition. Either the presbytery can do their examination and then assign a commission to do the ordination, or if the full presbytery does the ordination, then they can assign a commission to do the examination. And Overture 24 would just clarify that either way, no matter whether the ordination itself is done by a commission or by the full presbytery also needs to do the examination. Overture 30 has to do with when a minister transfers from one presbytery to another. He remains under the jurisdiction of his old presbytery until his transfer is formally accepted by the new presbytery. So Overture 30 says that there's no particular provision in the Book of Church Order right now for the old presbytery to record in its minutes when he's been formally accepted in the new presbytery. And the suggestion is that that language might be helpful just in case something comes up. It would be really clear when he was under the jurisdiction of one presbytery versus the other. Overture 49 is seeking to achieve better balance between the representation of teaching elders and ruling elders at presbytery or general assembly. In the PCA, the parity of elders, the parity of ruling and teaching elders is a really important aspect of our polity, and it's especially focused on honoring the importance of the office of ruling elder. But as you might imagine, oftentimes there's less representation from ruling elders than from teaching elders in a presbytery or a general assembly. And a lot of times this just has to do with the fact that ruling elders are volunteer leaders, whereas teaching elders usually are vocational leaders. And so a teaching elder could attend presbytery or general assembly as a part of his job, whereas a ruling elder would need to presumably take vacation time to do that, and it might be a little more difficult. So this overture proposes to try and address that issue by changing the allowable representation. Currently, For the first 350 communing members of a church, each church can send 2 ruling elders to presbytery or general assembly. This would raise that level from 2 to 3 for the first 350 members. Overture 64 proposes to allow honorably retired teaching elders to maintain their membership in a presbytery and then also hold associate membership in a local PCA church. Currently, when a teaching elder retires, he still maintains his membership in the presbytery. And this is because he could be pulpit supply, he could serve the Lord's Supper if a pastor was on vacation. He can still do some of the duties of a teaching elder. And so his membership in the presbytery is still relevant. But also, he may not receive the same shepherding and oversight that he would have while he was employed full-time as a teaching elder. And so this overture suggests that one answer to that problem might be for him to have an associate membership in a local PCA church. We do currently have a category of associate membership in the BCO, but it's mostly used for situations where a person is going to temporarily be in another location, like a college student who doesn't want to permanently transfer his membership to a new college, but he does want some care and oversight of a church that's near where he's going to college. Overture 84 would require ruling elders and deacons to reaffirm their agreement with the standards every year and state whether any of their views have changed, and for presbyteries to oversee this. Okay, now let's talk about some of the overtures related to women and their service in the church. First of all, there are quite a number of overtures that address titles and what titles women or unordained people may hold. Overture 14 proposes to add a significant amount of new language to 3 different paragraphs in the BCO, and I'll read just one part of the language that's proposed to be added to the end of BCO 7-3. Furthermore, unordained people, whether publicly or privately, shall neither be elected, commissioned, appointed, installed, designated, or otherwise given the title of pastor, elder, or deacon, nor shall they be denominated with any synonymous title, including but not limited to shepherd, shepherdess, elderess, pastoress, minister, deaconess, or other designation which might reasonably communicate or imply the holding of the office of pastor, elder, or deacon, or their having the authority to exercise any of the functions thereof. Overture 34 seeks to clarify that the only acceptable reason not to ordain deacons is because of a lack of qualified candidates, and in such case, those responsibilities would fall to the ordained elders and not to any unordained people. Overture 36 seeks to outline the duties that are only for officers, and then to limit those actions only to the ordained officers. So it would add 2 different paragraphs. 811 would say, the duties and authority of elders, including but not limited to leading in congregational worship, voting in session meetings, and shepherding the congregation, shall be exercised only by ordained elders. Women and unordained men shall not exercise ruling authority, perform the functions of the ordained office, or be commissioned, appointed, or installed in any manner that implies parity with or equivalence to ordained elders. And then 9-8 would read, the duties and authority of the diaconate, including but not limited to leadership in mercy ministries, voting in diaconal meetings, financial distribution, and property oversight, shall be exercised only by ordained deacons. Women and unordained men shall not exercise independent authority in these matters, perform the functions of the ordained office, or be commissioned, appointed, or installed in any manner that implies parity with or equivalence to ordained deacons. This overture would also encourage presbyteries to review the practices of congregations within their jurisdiction related to these issues. Overture 48 proposes to add the following phrase to the end of BCO 7-2, and thus it is unlawful for any court to commission or otherwise appoint, or for a congregation to elect or otherwise approve a woman as deaconess, shepherdess, or any other pretended office, and add this phrase to the end of 7-3, nor may they be assigned other titles which by their nature imply the authority of those offices. Overture 52 adds a paragraph to the end of BCO 7 to clarify that churches may not create new ecclesiastical offices. Overture 72 would require that sessions record in their minutes every year the members of the session and the members of the diaconate, and if there isn't a diaconate, then they need to state why there's not a diaconate and verify that the session has taken on these responsibilities. There are some overtures that seek to expand the roles or even the ordination of women in the church. Overture 37 argues from church history and modern scholarship that the office of deacon should be open to women as well as men, and it proposes to modify one word in BCO 9-3, changing men of spiritual character to members of spiritual character. But in light of this change, the overture also notes 12 other sections in the Book of Church Order that would need to be amended to adapt gender-specific language to allow for officers of either gender. And it should be noted that this overture would not require any churches to ordain women as deacons, but instead would allow each church to decide individually whether they are going to ordain women to the office of deacon or not. Overture 38 does not propose to allow women to be ordained to the office of deacon, but instead it proposes 3 options for churches to carry out the work of mercy ministry within a congregation, with the session deciding which pattern the congregation will follow. Option 1 is only ordaining men to serve in the office of deacon. Option 2 would be ordained men serve in the office of deacon, and then commissioned or appointed women who are not officers but bear the title of deacon. And then option 3 is commissioned men and women who are not officers but bear the title of deacon. Overture 71 says that with a 3/4 consent of the congregation, the session itself may administer the diaconate and then appoint non-ordained volunteers to help. And they could be called diaconal assistants or diaconal mercy team or something similar. Overture 74 adds an additional chapter to the BCO. Interestingly, they would number this chapter 17A so that all of the following chapters don't have to be renumbered. But this new chapter would be titled Of Commissioning for Non-Ordained Ministry. Chapter 16 of the BCO covers the doctrine of vocation, and Chapter 17 covers the doctrine of ordination, so 17A would cover commissioning for non-ordained ministry. This overture specifies that commissioning would not be creating an office of the church and would never constitute the governing authority of elders. It would have to be under the oversight of a session or presbytery, and that role could be revoked by the session or presbytery at will. There would be a written job description, training, examination, and then a commissioning process, which would be distinct from ordination, and that would have to be clearly communicated to the congregation. There are a couple of overtures that relate to who may serve communion. Overtures 31 and 60 are very similar. Overture 31 specifies that only ruling elders of the church may distribute the element except in, quote, extraordinary circumstances. And they clarify that distributing refers to the act of handing the elements to multiple communicants, not the passive action of passing trays or elements down the rows or the pews. Overture 16 would limit the distribution of elements to ruling elders or deacons if there are not enough ruling elders present. Some other overtures that propose to limit specific roles. Overture 58 would limit sessions and presbytery clerks to ruling elders or teaching elders. And Overture 38 would require that any courses on the systematic study of the Bible or Bible doctrine at Covenant College or Covenant Theological Seminary be taught only by teaching or ruling elders in NAPARC. NAPARC is the North American Presbyterian and Reformed Churches. It includes the PCA. It also includes the ARP, the OPC, several smaller Presbyterian denominations. And finally, Overture 61 recommends that the PCA adopt the Danvers Statement as a biblically faithful statement. Now that we've covered the basic outline of the overtures in these categories and what they propose to do, I want to share some commentary. And full disclosure, everything after this point is my own opinion, and it doesn't represent the views of anyone other than me. And before I dive in, I want to share just a little bit of where I stand, not because my own opinion is all that significant, but because I know that when you listen to someone talk about an issue, it's normal to wonder what perspective that person is coming from. So just for the sake of reference, the church I attend has a diaconate that is entirely composed of ordained male deacons. We do not currently have any assistants to the deacons or any unordained members with any titles related to church office. Our worship service is primarily led by our pastor. We also have leadership from our ruling elders and from a man under the care of presbytery. Our pastor administers the communion, and we have a ruling elder on each side holding trays of bread as we all come down to the front to get the elements and return to our seats. Although I do find some of the arguments thought-provoking, I am not persuaded or not yet persuaded that Scripture calls for the ordination of women to the office of deacon, though I think it's really clear that ordaining women to the office of deacon and ordaining women to the office of elder are dramatically different conversations with dramatically different implications. So I just said all that to convey that my thoughts on these matters are not about defending anything in particular in my own church or my own personal experience of serving there. My goal really is to carefully represent what it looks like to filter these conversations through our doctrine and especially through our unique polity in the PCA. So first of all, Overture 61 relates to adopting the Danvers Statement as a biblically faithful statement. I have 3 concerns with this. First of all, it truly wouldn't have any real impact on the life of our church. It would not be binding in any way. It would not require anyone to do anything. It would simply be a statement of this one particular General Assembly. Second of all, the language of the Danvers Statement is heavily focused on authority and submission and hierarchy, which is a very narrow aspect of what it means to be a man in Christ or a woman in Christ. And we've seen the harmful impacts this can have to relationships in the church, and especially the shepherding of women in the church. When we think of men as primarily moving through life characterized by authority, and women primarily moving through life as characterized by submission. Whether we are men or women, we all interact in life in our several places and relations as superiors, inferiors, or equals in different contexts. But my biggest concern with this statement is that it was crafted by an organization known as the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And as they've promoted these views, a significant portion of their argument is based on what is actually a Trinitarian heresy. I won't go into all the details here. I'll link to an article that goes into more depth in the show notes, but we're talking about what's either called eternal subordination of the Son, ESS, or eternal functional subordination, EFS. And this concern is best summed up by a quote from a PCA pastor named Todd Pruitt in something he wrote in 2016. He said, "The fact is, CBMW has not been neutral regarding the doctrine of the Son's eternal subordination to the Father. It is true that some members of CBMW's council reject that errant doctrine. However, the fact remains that CBMW has deliberately and repeatedly built its theological support for the complementary roles of men and women upon this deeply flawed doctrine of the Trinity." I have searched to see if CBMW has issued any clarification or repudiation of this heresy, and I can't find any evidence that they have. If we really need a statement on these issues, I would far prefer that we craft our own rather than just tip our hats to one that has such problematic doctrinal entanglements. Now let's talk about some of the overtures related to women's roles and serving in the church. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that the PCA believes in grassroots polity. So higher courts are required to show deference to lower courts in matters of what we refer to as discretion and judgment. Of course, tension exists when it comes to agreeing on what things qualify as matters of discretion and judgment, but I'd like to read a quote from L. Roy Taylor. He was a founding father of the PCA, and he was stated clerk of the PCA from 1998 to 2020, so for 22 years. And this is something he said in reflecting back on the 2008 General Assembly. "We have recently had several overtures to the 36th General Assembly, and judicial cases arise to the SJC regarding women being involved in mercy ministries or leading women's ministry. Addressing the issue of deaconesses and the role of women in the church is one of the instances in which we have to do theological reflection within a confessional church. Moreover, it is also an instance in which using polity or the judicial process to resolve a theological issue is quite alluring." And later on, he goes on to say, "The General Assembly has taken the position that we do not ordain women, BCO 7.2 and 24.1, but the Assembly has left the matter of exactly what women may do or may not do within the ministry of a local church to the discretion of the respective sessions. This is in keeping with PCA polity. The default setting for PCA polity is that when the BCO is silent, the broadest discretion is left to the lower courts to make decisions within the bounds of biblical principles and constitutional parameters. So the ways in which we handle the women's issue impinges not only on how we do theological reflection within a confessional church, it also touches on our unique polity. I'll link to the full text of that statement in the show notes, but I agree with Mr. Taylor. Our polity suggests that we need to be slow to handle these issues by legislation or judicial process. And it's also important to note that the specific title of deaconess has a historical precedent in specifically the Southern Presbyterian Church from which we find our roots. I've written an article about this, and I'll link to it in the show notes, outlining some of the history of the use of that term. But it's important to point out that the role of assistant to the deacons, which is currently covered in BCO 9-7, was originally designed specifically for women. It was only as recent as 1974 that paragraph was amended to include men also. And as a matter of fact, in the very earliest drafts of our current BCO, dating back to 1867 from the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America, this paragraph read, "The New Testament authorizes the employment of godly women in the diaconal function. Wherefore, it is proper, where it shall appear needful, that the church session select and appoint deaconesses for the care of the sick, of prisoners, of poor widows and orphans, and in general for the relief of distress." So it's certainly valid to have conversations about the helpfulness or the usefulness of that title or other titles today. But I think charity obligates us to refrain from assuming motives, especially when there is historical precedent that predates any of our current social movements. So with that background in mind, let's dive into some of the specific proposals. Overtures 31 and 60 propose to limit who can distribute the elements of communion. The BCO is really clear that only teaching elders can administer the sacraments, but it does not speak to distribution. Now, traditionally in Presbyterian history, members of the congregation would come down to the front of the church to get the elements, so this conversation about who should distribute is only a relatively recent discussion. Personally, I think it makes the most sense for this to be done by our ruling elders. But I'm not convinced that this is something that needs to be legislated from the top down for every church in the denomination. We debated this issue last year, and we decided not to specify it in the Book of Church Order. And also, I would really like to see us adopt the revisions that the Directory for Worship Study Committee has made before we get into amending any of those paragraphs. Overture 83 is the one that requires that courses on systematic study of the Bible or Bible doctrine at Covenant College or Theological Seminary be taught by NAPARC elders. And my concern with this overture is that we need to be careful not to conflate other gatherings and other teaching settings with the public worship of God. College is not a church. Even seminary is not a church. Leadership and teaching in college or seminary is not the same as ordained office or teaching in a worship service. College and seminary are educational institutions that people can take advantage of in exchange for tuition. Overture 58 proposes to limit the role of session or presbytery clerk to only ordained elders. My dad has spent over 3 decades serving as clerk, both as an elder on a session and as an elder emeritus. It's a lot of work. I don't think that limiting this role to ordained elders is necessary, and unless we've observed a pattern of trouble with our current system, I would suggest that we not make it any harder than it already is to secure volunteers to help with this daunting task. Now let's talk about the office of deacon. I think that Scripture is clear that the office of deacon is one that Christ, as king and head of his church, has instituted for the service of the church in general, and then specifically for the purpose of removing obligations from the elders so that they can be free to focus on the teaching and the discipleship. There are certainly times in the life of the church where there may not be qualified men who are able to serve as deacons. And in those cases, elders are certainly qualified to take on those responsibilities, but it should be seen as a less than ideal temporary situation and not the permanent game plan. So although I understand the idea behind Overture 71 in allowing the session to formally oversee the diaconal ministry and then appoint non-ordained volunteers to carry out the tasks, I think it functionally undermines the God-given office of deacon and specifically its God-intended purpose in the life of the church. I have the same concerns with Overture 38. We currently have sufficient provisions in place in our Book of Church Order. We should be seeking to acknowledge and affirm the inward call of qualified men to the office of deacon by ordaining them. And our polity also already provides the option of appointing assistants to the deacons. The third option of Overture 38, which would be to have no ordained deacons but all voluntary appointed deacons, is similar to Overture 71, and I believe it would effectually undermine the God-given office of deacon. We don't create leaders or servants in the church. We acknowledge the gifts that Christ has given his church. That's why I believe it's important that we ordain qualified deacons. But there are two sides to this coin, right? We also need to make use of the gifts that Christ has given his body that don't lead to ordained office. And that includes not placing unnecessary restrictions that would handicap sessions from making wise use of these gifts. There are a number of overtures about limiting the titles that we can give to unordained people, and I understand the concerns these overtures are attempting to address, but I don't believe that changes to the BCO are the best way to address these concerns. First of all, some of these overtures go into far more detail than I think is wise to include in our Constitution, and even some language that seems beneath the dignity of the BCO. Overture 14 is the most egregious example of this language, and it sounds almost mocking at times, listing titles that I've never even heard of, like elderess or pastoress. In addressing other past issues in the denomination, we've specifically declined to enumerate all of the potentially problematic vocabulary, understanding that once we begin naming specific vocabulary, we would be forever updating the BCO to include new troublesome language that develops. And right along these lines, even though it doesn't propose to make these changes to the BCO now, Overture 14 and its rationale actually lists over 50 other titles that it categorizes as quote-unquote questionable. And the list includes things like women's leader, women's care team, hospitality director, and biblical counselor. So if we start prohibiting specific titles now, is there ever going to be an end to the amendments to the Book of Church Order to prohibit more individual titles? In addition to the problem of prohibiting titles one at a time, there's also the question of overlap between the functions of officers in the church in their official capacity and then the functions of church members in general. Overtures 14 and 48 both talk about this, and Overtures 36 and 72 address it directly. Overture 36 seeks to outline the duties of officers and clarify that only officers may, quote, perform the functions of the ordained office. Now, to its credit, this overture does seek to clarify what it means in the proposed new language. It spells out things like voting on the session or the diaconate and the authority of those offices, and in those areas I would agree. But there's so much additional gray area. For example, as currently outlined in the BCO, assistants to the deacons are tasked with assisting the deacons in their work. So that implies that they will be performing similar duties as the ordained deacons. BCO 8.3 talks about the duties of elders, and it says that some of these responsibilities are also the duties of private Christians. So just consider with me the second half of BCO 8.3. They should visit the people at their homes, especially the sick. They should instruct the ignorant, comfort the mourner, nourish and guard the children of the church. They should set a worthy example to the flock entrusted to their care by their zeal to evangelize the unconverted, make disciples, and demonstrate hospitality. All those duties which private Christians are bound to discharge by the law of love are especially incumbent upon them by divine vocation, and are to be discharged as official duties. They should pray with and for the people, being careful and diligent in seeking the fruit of the preached word among the flock. So, I know that this issue is difficult to navigate, and when we see issues that feel like they are a violation of the spirit of our polity, it's tempting to want to handle that by new BCO language. But new legislation rarely changes hearts, and in fact, I would suggest that it may result in a negative impact on congregations that are already seeking to honor our polity in good faith. Overture 74 proposes to allow the commissioning of non-ordained people for specific purposes. It was interesting to me to see that PCA teaching elder David Coffin suggested that we develop a study committee to look at the question of commissioning. It's something that we already use in some specific contexts, like sending missionaries out onto the field, but it is never defined or addressed in our Book of Church Order. And even past SJC rulings have suggested that it's not properly considered a synonym for ordination, but we don't currently have any guidelines for clarifying what that would look like or what its proper uses are, if any. And finally, let's talk about Overture 37, which seeks to open the possibility of ordaining women to the office of deacon on a church-by-church basis. Passing this overture would represent a major doctrinal and polity change. As seen in the overture, it would require changing many parts of the Book of Church Order. Ordination is a core aspect of our polity, and with all humility, I do not believe it's something that churches should decide on an individual basis. Ordaining women to the office of deacon is a change that would only work if it was based on broad consensus, and that is clearly not present in the PCA at this time. We are already experiencing tension between groups in the PCA, and there are some who are expressing the idea that we, in essence, have two different denominations that exist within the PCA. I don't agree with that assessment, but having a group of churches that ordain women as deacons and a different group of churches that don't ordain women as deacons would definitely exacerbate that perception. Another thing to consider is that the office of deacon is a perpetual office. So what happens to a woman who is ordained in one PCA church and then goes to another PCA church that doesn't recognize that ordination? I would submit that it is just not workable to make ordination something that individual churches can decide for themselves. Well, thank you for joining me in this conversation about the 2026 overtures. I am especially thankful to any lay people who have taken the time to learn more about our church government and polity as a part of faithfully seeking the purity and peace of the church. Please do pray for everyone who will be traveling to the General Assembly, me included, and that the business that happens there would honor God. I'll be back in early July with one final episode to share my reflections on General Assembly. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer run and 100% donor supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lynna Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.